my last video said that I said that there were nuanced issues to most of the political ideas out there right now that make them not viable to me. And the minimum wage one is a really good issue, because in theory it sounds good. You make more money, everybody's happy if you were making less than minimum wage because now your pay has increased. But in practice, there are a few things wrong with it. The first thing is, how is pay determined when your pay is above minimum wage? Well, it's pretty simple. Your pay is determined by what the market demands of that company. And what does that mean? Well, I'm an IT person, right? So I decide I need to seriously start looking for a job, and then I research different IT jobs I can get. And then researching different IT jobs I can get, I see that entry-level IT people make X, mid-level make Y, senior-level people make Z, right? And so I say, well, I believe I am just between entry-level and mid-level. So I should be searching for jobs that are willing to pay me, in between X and Y. Okay, so that's part one. Part two is, consider that the amount of money you make over minimum wage, if it's dictated by your perceived value of your skills and labor, and then minimum wage increases, it artificially increases the cost of labor. So, for instance, minimum wage was $7.25 an hour when I first got my IT job, and I was making $10 an hour. If you increase minimum wage from $7.25 to $10, while I was already making $10 doing more work, then why would I be incentivized to keep doing that job? I could just go back down to a regular retail job and make the same money. So what do I have to do? Well, I don't have to do anything, but the employer has to further incentivize paying me to stay in a job with more responsibility, because otherwise I can go somewhere else and make the same money. So the employer would likely raise their cost even more to compensate for the fact that this position requires more skilled labor than a minimum wage position. And so that scales exponentially. And I don't understand why no one's had that conversation. But then there's the really, really big point. And the restaurant industry in like New York and Chicago are a great example of this if you want to Google that. And that is, your net expense as an employee is always going to be worth less than the value you add to the company. If it's not, then there's no point in you working for the company. What do I mean by that? Well, if you make $10 an hour for the company, the value, actually, let's not use numbers here, because it's not going to be like, okay, if you make $10 an hour, then your value to the company is probably 12. But let's flip that and say you make $15 an hour, and then the company crunches numbers or does an assessment and says, well, actually this position is only worth $8 an hour to the company. Well, you're making 15. What happens to you? You either lose money, or you get reassigned somewhere else, or you don't work there anymore. And the reason for that is the company can't afford to pay you more than the value that you are bringing to the company. And they can't even afford to pay you the exact value you're bringing to the company because of their cost for employing you to begin with. What do I mean by that? So when you get a job and you go off and you're making $10 an hour, right? Let's use that number. Your cost to the company is not $10 an hour. Your cost to the company is your payroll plus the FICA tax, we'll talk about that in a bit, plus the cost to maintain whatever payroll employees or payroll software or payroll accounting firm that actually manages, sorts all that stuff and issues and cuts your check, right? So there's actually overhead involved in actually paying the employee, and that cost scales with the cost of the employee. Meaning, you make $10, you make $15, everything else can stay flat, right? The cost of the employees that manage your payroll, the cost of the company that issues you a check does not change. But your FICA taxes, so let's talk about them, they change with your income. For people who don't know, FICA is basically your Social Security tax and your Medicare tax. And combined, there's 7.65% of your income. And what that means is 7.65% of your paycheck is redirected to FICA tax. And people don't understand, like, when the conversation about raising taxes is concerned, like, I don't like the fact that FICA tax is a separate thing from federal tax, because it all goes to the same pot, believe it or not. It's like they're supposed to be earmarked for specific things, but it floats around, it gets bounced around. Congress is terrible. It doesn't matter what political party is in power. Like, the way they manage federal income tax is ridiculous, but that's a whole nother story. So let's use raw numbers. So you can get out a pen, paper, pad, your notes app on your phone if you want to follow me along and check my work. But let's say you're Jennifer Smo, right? And Jennifer, she's going to be single this time around. We're going to do it again with dependents. So she's going to be single, making $10 an hour, right? So Jennifer Smo, who's single, making $10 an hour, you're going to have your federal income tax coming out. Single, no dependents, making $10 an hour is going to be $71 for a bi-weekly paycheck, meaning you're making $800 a check. And then your FICA tax that's billed directly from your check, that's collected by your employer, is going to be an extra $61.20 that comes out of your check. So that means with just federal income tax, and FICA tax alone, you go from making $800 a check to $667. And then you got to understand that, in some states, they take more off of that. So you can see how your income drastically goes down, right? And so let's say the minimum wage kicked in and you went from $10 to $15 an hour, right? So you make more money. You go from $800 every 2 weeks to $1,200 every 2 weeks. But your share of the FICA tax increases as well. So now you pay $91.80 in FICA tax and $119 in federal income tax, meaning you go from $1,200 to $989.20, not counting state tax or any other deductions like 401k or or your like medical insurance or something like that. So why this is significant is because what you have to understand is that your FICA tax that you pay gets matched by your employer, and so your expense is not the expense of you to your employer is not just the $15 an hour or the $10 an hour you were making. Your expense is that plus 7.65%, meaning an increase from $10 an hour to $15 an hour. And mind you, the minimum wage in a lot of places is lower than this, and they increased it to 15 over 4 or 5 years. Is $10 to $15 an hour in and of itself is a 50% increase on expenses. The reason why this creates a strain on businesses, first of all, we need to categorize, right? So if you look at places like Costco, Walmart, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, Apple, I don't even know if they had any minimum wage employees, probably not, right? Microsoft either, actually, for that matter. But they can absorb an additional cost to the wage increase because of their very, very large profit margin. It's not a big deal, right? But this rule for the minimum wage increase was across the board in the states that passed it. So what you saw was smaller companies, smaller shops, especially restaurants, basically ceasing to exist because they could not afford this 50% increase in expenses. It doesn't matter how long you take to phase that increase in expenses in, because there's a thing called inflation. We'll probably talk about that in another video when we get deeper into finance. But basically, inflation is, in layman's terms, how your dollar loses value year over year. And so because of inflation and having to keep up with the fact that things like for a restaurant for example, this is another term we need to get into called cost of goods sold, right? So what cost of goods sold is, very quickly, say I want to sell this pen. I got this pen and I was able to buy this pen for $5. and then I'm selling this pen for 15 bucks, right? So the cost of goods sold for this pen is $5 because that's how much I paid to accrue it. That's how much acquire, excuse me. That's how much I paid to acquire the pen. Here's the thing though. 2 years from now, it might cost the manufacturer $7 to make this pen, which means it cost me $7 to buy this pen, which means now my cost of goods sold on the pen I was selling for $15 is $7, right? So because I went from a $5 cost of goods sold to a $7 cost of goods sold, I have a 40% decrease in 40% increase in expenses for the pen. And because of that, you got to look at the profit that's left, right? So I was selling the pen for 15, so I was making 10, and now I'm making 8, right? That's a 20% decrease in profit. So cost of goods sold matter. And just imagine having to deal with the cost of goods sold at the same time that you're dealing with the increase in net expense for your employees that's being forced on you. And then you can see why smaller companies with smaller profit margins, like when I say smaller profit margins, and I'm targeting the restaurant industries because there's statistical data that shows restaurants as big as like the Ruth Chris franchise, on average across all of the Ruth Chris in the country, only make about 10% profit, right? So that's very low in terms of income. They don't have the money to deal with cost of goods sold and rising net expense for employees. And so the restaurants in these cities and states that are affected are compensated in many ways. They're raising the prices directly for customers. Some places actually added like a additional expense to the bill that said, hey, you need to pay this extra fee for taxes because we can't afford it, right? Some reduced the staff drastically. Some reduced the staff's working hours drastically. Some changed their benefits package because they could no longer afford it with the wage they were paying an employee. And hopefully what I expressed to you is a clear example of why. There are multiple other factors that are involved in how pay is calculated. And so it's up to you to understand basically that. It's up to you to understand your value, your role in the economy and in the market, and not rely on the government to get you paid. All right. So my next video is going to be talking about personal taxes while I have my research for business tax up. So stay tuned for that. I don't know when it'll be released, but this video, you'll probably be recorded within 30 or 40 minutes of this video, but I'm very slow to release content these days. Peace out.